everyone to our annual Advanced Study Institute in Cultural Psychiatry. This is actually the 25th meeting, a workshop of this type. So we have a long history of trying this and having very rewarding experiences for the most part. This is part of the annual McGill summer program in social and cultural psychiatry, which includes a range of courses that are presented every year. But the Advanced Study Institute changes from year to year. The topic is usually chosen as something that's of interest to our own group in terms of current work that people are doing. And it gives us an opportunity to invite people from elsewhere to try to have extended conversations with them around areas of common interest. And because psychiatry and healthcare in general represents a kind of an area of applied knowledge, it gives us the kind of space where we can easily invite in people from very different disciplines who might not ordinarily be in conversation with each other around a common object of concern, in this case, how we understand the nature of mental life, of emotional life, of experience, and in particular of problems that people have that fall under the broad domain of psychiatric conditions. As I said, this is the 25th of these workshops. Here are the themes of the past workshops. And as I say, they've reflected current research projects or concerns that we had, and they've been highly interdisciplinary. And that's really what we're hoping for. As you'll see, we have with us today philosophers, cognitive scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, anthropologists. So we have really a range of people who are coming at this from very different angles, with very different conceptual frameworks, very different methodologies. And the challenge, of course, is to find something interesting to say to each other, since part of our work, we operate in very different communities. We can say epistemic communities in terms of what kinds of knowledge, what's an interesting question, what's a meaningful answer. There are some substantial differences. But as I say, we think in the healthcare setting we're very privileged by having objects of concern that everybody would agree are important. They're important to try to understand somehow, and we can sort of justify being pretty liberal in what we try to borrow from. The challenge is to borrow in a way that doesn't do an injustice to the particular framework and way of thinking. And so that's part of what we're hoping to do today, is not only introduce to you some very different ways of thinking about mental health problems and human experience in general, but to do it in a way that gives you a bit of a grip on what the particular point of view is and what it offers us that's complementary to other points of view. As I mentioned, this is part of our annual summer program, and it's actually the 29th summer program that started a few years before we started these Advanced Study Institutes, and next year will be the 30th, so we're hoping to have some kind of a reunion to bring back some of the people. We've had people who were here 30 years ago and who came many times and who we haven't seen in years, so we're already anticipating a big kind of reunion. The things that prompted this particular theme at this moment in time have to do with other activities within the division and in other quarters of McGill. We've had for some years now a Culture, Mind, and Brain program, funded initially by the Foundation for Psychocultural Research in Los Angeles, that tries to bring to bear interdisciplinary perspectives on the nature of brain function and so far as it relates to psychiatry. And as I'll be talking about in a moment, psychiatry is very heavily invested these days in the idea that understanding the brain is going to give us a kind of skeleton key to understanding mental disorders. And many of us have concerns that while that's undoubtedly important, crucial even, it's not the whole story. And we have to find a way to tell a better set of stories that are more inclusive of human experience. And that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today. Not so much neuroscience today, and a lot of the larger context in which whatever we might say about the brain has to be understood. One other impetus for this meeting is an ongoing project. It's now nearing the end of a 7-8 year span, called Healthy Brains, Healthy Lives, which was a large research initiative at McGill and with in part partners with Western University Ontario and University of Montreal and many other partners to try to promote neuroscience research in a way that would address major health and societal issues. and to do it through many different methods, but at the center is an investment in the idea of neuroinformatics, of big data neuroinformatics, the idea that we have now tens of thousands of brain images of people. Sometimes we have cohorts that have been followed repeatedly with all kinds of other measures. If we can make all that available in a way so that people can access it, there are all kinds of interesting questions that could be asked that will not occur to the particular group that might have collected that data. So the idea is to do that and actually interdigitates with an idea of open science, that the access to that data should be readily available to people. People who have a good question should be able to come and get access and work with it. And that's the sort of philosophy. The databases that are available include things from Canada, but also the UK Biobank and ABCD study, all these really large studies that have rich data. And our concern in relation to that has been, well, what are the role of social determinants of health, social context, and so on? How those are present in some of those databases in different ways. They can be used to answer very interesting questions. There's been work at McGill here on looking at things like loneliness and its impact on the brain and so on. So there are lots of interesting things that can be done. But that also requires, and that's part of the theme today, thinking carefully about what we mean by social context and social determinants, that there's work to be done. Just as so much brilliant work is going on refining our methodologies in neuroscience, we need to be refining our methodologies in social sciences in ways that are meaningful for this kind of work. One of the things that is a key deliverable in the Canadian Framework for Brain Health, in the Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives, is this Canadian Framework for Brain Health, which is meant to be a kind of way of thinking about neuroscience research and particularly policy-related things that could be done to promote well-being. The phrase brain health gives some of us some pause because it's like, well, is there any other kind of health? Do we really need the word brain there, since the brain is pretty implicated in everything that we do? But there's lots of other things that are implicated. So putting the brain front and center is a little bit odd, but it poses specific challenges, and it's meant to do specific work. And in particular, in our case, working with this metaphor or construct has been important because we're trying to ensure that under the umbrella of brain health we include the things that really matter to people. And that means, of course, their individual experience, their families, their life worlds, their aspirations, all those things that are not easy to reduce to a variable that you measure in the brain, but that have to be front and center in this work. So we've been involved in trying to begin to articulate what a framework for brain health would look like. Canada had a framework for mental health some years ago, and meant to guide policy and research and activity, so this is along those lines. And these are the kinds of broad principles we've been trying to elaborate, and again, the meeting today hopefully will contribute to our thinking about that. First of all, the insistence that we have to understand the brain in context, hence our title, The Situated Brain. The brain is in a body, the body's in a person, in a world, in networks, as we'll be hearing, and we have to have ways of thinking about that and trying not to think about the brain as in a vat, in the philosophical vat, or in some kind of laboratory, in a scanner, or whatever, sort of divorced from its ecological context. The brain, the body, human beings are fundamentally processes that emerge through development, so we have to embrace the sort of temporal dimension of development across the lifespan, not only because the brain, human functioning is changing all the time, but because people at different stages in that long arc have different experiences, have different needs, and interact with each other. So that putting the sort of the lifespan and the ecological together, it becomes important how elders relate to infants, and how people before they have a child, what kind of environment they're in, and all these kinds of larger temporal connections to unfolding development. The third broad set of principles we have relate to the fact that there's huge diversity in all human populations. People are affected by different cultural backgrounds, have different social positions related to things like gender and ethnicity and education and so on. And those, again, lead them to be occupying different niches and have different trajectories in their life. So that has to be taken very seriously and not sort of homogenized out of the picture in some ways. The fourth broad principle we have is the idea of being person-centered. And this is a way, as part of what we use to pull everything together, is to say, well, if we're not simply trying to develop knowledge in psychiatry about specific disorders, that's a possible toolkit we might have, but it's not the overall or the ultimate goal. If we're really trying to meet people, individual people, at a certain moment of crisis or suffering and respond in some kind of way that's useful to them, then we have to have a way of understanding people as persons, as having I view the person, I guess, as the sort of social face of the self, as people have an interiority, have concerns, and have a certain set of predicaments in the world that we need to help them make sense of. So, and those are sort of, I would say, 4 or 5 broad principles of how we're trying to conceptualize neuroscience and its role in psychiatry. And the ways to do that involve, first and foremost for us, interdisciplinarity, that we need many different disciplinary perspectives and voices in the conversation, but that poses significant challenges, again, as I alluded to earlier, to not just sort of wave our hands that, then the brain happens, or then interactions happen, but to be able to tell a more detailed story that actually yields some insight into what's going on. Then also the notion that this needs to be done in deep conversation with people who have various kinds of lived experience, because they are going to both have essential insights into what the real issues are, and be a fundamental sort of reality check on the theory building or the interpretation of results and so on that's going on in scientific enterprise. So that also poses challenges in terms of what kinds of conversations can we have where other perspectives are really being heard and really being taken on board. So I'm setting all this out because I think you're going to see a pretty wide array of talks that share some or other of these concerns, and part of the challenge is how they might all fit together. So as I mentioned, I think the program has been changed slightly. We have some copies of it outside this on the table, so the program that we have here is still useful to you in terms of having the abstracts and having brief biographical notes. I won't do much introducing of people because you can read a more detailed biographical note about where they're from and all the great work that they've done. The flow is we're going to begin with a couple of talks about phenomenological perspectives and different ways of coming at the situatedness of experience. And then we will have a couple of papers that talk about sort of real-world contexts in which neuroscience knowledge is generated and in which people use ideas about the brain, ideas about problems, mental disorders, like neurological disorders, to make sense of their own experience. And so there's this kind of recursive process in which people experience their bodies, experiences their illnesses in a way that's mediated by, to some degree, by the kinds of models and theories and practices that we have, and that's very much the focus of things like social studies of science, anthropology of science, and so on. So we'll have that perspective. Then we'll have a panel discussion with the people from all of those presenters this morning, and then we'll break for lunch. In the afternoon, we have a session on modeling that talks a bit about what tools we have available to try to make these general ideas about how things are interconnected, including how experience is connected to the body and to context, to try to give a bit more precision to the way we think about that, to use some available modeling strategies that can offer us some insights. And first and foremost, as I think you'll hear, one thing that this does for us is it allows us, at least in a broad conceptual way, to begin to bridge the big divide that has existed in psychiatry and elsewhere between mechanistic explanations, what's actually going on here, how can we figure out what the causal pathways are, and explanations that attend to the quality and texture of experiences, its historicity, its dependence on context, and so on. So the idea that we're developing languages and conceptual toolkits for modeling the relationships between brain, body, person, history, context, and so on. And even though those models may be very oversimplified and sort of toy models that don't have a lot of content in them, they can nevertheless reveal very interesting and important dynamics and give us a scaffolding or a way to begin to put in particular histories, particular pathways, particular dilemmas, and so on that people are facing. So we'll have some discussion of that from 2 people who have been very creative leaders in particular approaches, or applying existing approaches to particular levels of analysis in this problem that I'm talking about. And then we'll end with 2 talks that think about how we should or can think about the brain in relation to mental disorders, a perspective from cultural clinical psychology and a perspective from cultural psychiatry. So I'm giving you this outline. We don't always list the whole pathway at the beginning of these things, but I think based on the experience of the last 2 days in the workshop, there's quite a diversity of perspectives and disciplinary approaches that you'll hear today, and I hope that this map shows you that they're not really, ultimately they're not unrelated to each other, even though the current state of development may be that they've been pretty much doing their own thing. I'm hopeful that this conversation, even in the last 2 days, is encouraging people to think that they have things to say to each other. I just noticed that Carl's here, and do you want to just come down and say a word, or just, I mean, it's up to you.
Well, thank you, Laurence. It's really a wonderful occasion. I'm the chief of the Department of Psychiatry here at the Jewish, so on behalf of our institution, I'd like to welcome you, and thank you for all your contributions to this really brilliant annual event.
Yeah, so thank you, Carl. I mean, our department is, this is the outpatient department of the psychiatry department of the Jewish General Hospital, and this has an august history. I mean, this is one of the centers, the center for family therapy in Canada, really in North America for many years, and has aspired to be also sort of community psychiatrically oriented. And Carl, in particular, as the chair for the last several years, has been very instrumental in helping build up the idea of both cultural psychiatry and the Culture, Mind, and Brain program, which is really intended to be centered here at this hospital. So we're very appreciative of the resources. Part of why we can do these things on, I should say, on a shoestring is because of meaningful institutional support. So we have facilities that we can make use of and just sort of get on with the interesting work without having to struggle too much with the whole logistics. That's a very optimistic statement. I'll see how it goes. So thank you again, Carl, and to everyone here.